Today, my guest is a really, really interesting one. You might not have heard of him, author of The Batmaker of Copenhagen, Mr. Tim Brooks. Tim, very good to have you along, sir.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to our chat.
So, first of all, a little bit about you. A bit like me, you tried admirably on the field, and yeah, didn't get as good as some of the other people around you. So you channeled your love of the game into writing, and you started off. You've contributed to fairly esteemed organisations. Is it Wisdom that you've written for, and others?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, really, how it came about was I was kind of naturally intrigued, as I think a lot of cricket fans are, about um, the many cricket teams that play across the world that you hear a bit less about. So you might say that was underneath Test level, and it always was odd to me that you heard about in football loads and loads of teams, and yet in cricket all of the discussion was on kind of Australia and England and India and a few others. And at the time, which we're talking about kind of early noughties, I suppose, there was really very little coverage of kind of non-test nations. It's improved a bit since, but it was definitely a bit of a gap in the market. And I thought, well, maybe that's something that I can, kind of add some value on. And I started to focus on that, and it kind of snowballed a bit from there.
You did a bit of commentary as well, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. So, interestingly, I was just starting to write for Wisdom, and I'd gone out to Dubai to cover a T20 global qualifier. And while I was out there, there was a kind of live streaming team, and I got invited on as a guest. And then an hour later, I was the lead commentator for the rest of the tournament.
Wow.
And then we went on to this is QTV Sports, which is still in operation, and we went on to cover a lot of ODI and T20 cricket at associate level. Um, there was a few highlights in that. So I don't know if you remember, but there was a tied ODI between Pakistan and Ireland in Ireland, where Ed Joyce made 100. And we also covered a Netherlands Bangladesh game, which the Netherlands won. And then in between that, yeah, quite a lot of the kind of associate nation level cricket. Also did a bit of last man stands and a few other bits and bobs. And that was, yeah, a really interesting period. I kind of scaled that down a bit when I started a family, but yeah, very interesting few years doing commentary.
Yeah, kids change your direction a little bit, don't they? It's interesting, your involvement in the non-test aspect of the game. It is quite amazing when you start digging down into that area of just how many nations play cricket, whether it's through expats, um, and in certain circumstances, if you go a bit further back before there was a kind of a real uh, movement of labour across the world, how the game established itself in various corners. It wasn't just about the British Empire and colonialism. It did pop up in some unexpected places. Now, Denmark being one of them. Do you want to just tell us before we get into the book? Um, and it's there's an excellent piece at the end of the book in the historical notes which explains how cricket took a foothold in Denmark. Do you want to just explain to us how it came about?
Yeah, so it was an interesting one because it was a British influence, but not in the kind of normal kind of empire context. So the first kind of cricket was played by English railway engineers that went over. So Denmark went through the Industrial Revolution a bit later in the mid 19th century, and they looked to kind of England's expertise on railways, and they played some games while they were over there, including some with the locals. But the more significant kind of channel was through upper class Danes who went to English public schools and brought their kind of love of the game back with them from there. I guess, because of their class and influence, they were able to hold quite a lot of sway with kind of Danish government, and they definitely had a kind of mission, not just to introduce cricket, but to introduce kind of cricket's values. Um, and yeah, I think I talk a bit in that annex around how, there was a few decades in the late 19th century before football had really started developing as a structured sport on the continent, where cricket had an opportunity to be the major game in continental Europe, and ultimately missed that opportunity.
Mm.
But the first games were played, the first club games were played in 1866. So it has a very long heritage in Denmark, as it does in the Netherlands as well.
And just reading through those notes, it does seem that cricket wasn't a million miles away from some of the local Danish traditional sports that we've been playing out there with bat and ball.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a game that was, I guess, the equivalent to rounders, which was called Langbold, and that was there was also a Norwegian game called Knet, which was similar, bat and ball sport essentially. So I think what they did, the kind of pioneers of cricket in Denmark, what they did is they took that kind of innate interest in the pre-existing sport, particularly the kind of thrill of hitting a ball a long way, and then they kind of layered on the kind of strategic nuance of cricket, which is a major reason why it captures the imagination of many people across the world. So that definitely helped establish it in Denmark, where it didn't in other countries in continental Europe.
And down the years, I mean, even stretching back to the Victorian times, there have been notable players, and even coming up to the sort of almost modern times, there is a rich history of talented Danish cricketers.
Yeah, I think the best known is probably Ole Mortensen, who's kind of a Derbyshire legend. I think he got 430 odd first class wickets. And he also quite an eccentric character as well. So I think he'll be particularly well known. There were a handful of others as well, and I think most recently, a good friend of mine actually, Freddie Clocker, who played for a couple of counties, made a couple of first class hundreds, and was captain of Denmark for a long time. Unfortunately, didn't secure a long term county contract, but yeah, so definitely a handful. It's quite an interesting link across to Irish cricket now as well, because Jeremy Bray, who people may remember was a kind of Irish international, was the coach of Denmark for a while, and some Danes have been playing first class cricket over in Ireland. So there's still that kind of connection there. We're probably past the heyday of Danish cricket, unfortunately. They're in a kind of rebuilding phase at the moment, but they're still in the major ICC global tournaments. So they're definitely one of the teams that I follow closely.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Batmaker of Copenhagen is out April the 1st, is it?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, but you can pre-order it on Amazon. So anyone listening to this or watching this should definitely do that. I was lucky enough to be given a copy, an advanced copy by your good self, and I whittled it off in a couple of days. Absolutely superb read, and I'm not saying that because you're here. I found it really interesting on a number of levels, which we'll sort of go through maybe bit by bit. But the overall thing, it's a thriller set in obviously in Copenhagen during World War II, with cricket as a backdrop. It got me thinking, in terms of writing something like this, you're faced with lots and lots of challenges. Let's start with the period of it. So it's in the middle. It's when the Nazis have taken over. They're sort of marching through Denmark, and the story is about a local cricket club on the brink of disappearing because of lack of equipment. And the story is about how they ultimately survive. So first, let me just ask you, how hard was it to write about something in Denmark during the war?
Yeah, good question. So I'm a kind of historian by, I've got a history degree and I've got a strong interest in history, so that helped. But I think one of the interesting things about the resistance in Denmark is that it's kind of less well known than maybe the French resistance or the Dutch resistance, where there's a lot more kind of films and books. So it took quite a lot of research, and it was a slightly different situation in Denmark because until 1943 at least, the Danish government stayed in place, albeit in a bit of a puppet government way. And there was kind of less overt signs of Nazi control. But the book starts at quite a pivotal point where the kind of resistance networks have grown in confidence, and the kind of hostilities are starting to escalate. So I did a lot of research on the different resistance groups, and also the link back to England. So as you can imagine, the British were quite keen on supporting the resistance groups because it was a way of kind of undermining the German war effort from within. And so I thought that was quite an interesting kind of triangular relationship to look at, the kind of resistance, the what the Nazis were doing and how that was different to other occupied territories, and then how the British were kind of supporting the Danish resistance effort at quite a key juncture in the war. So yeah, quite a lot of research into that aspect, and then also obviously trying to then combine what is quite a kind of personal story about the individual, who's the hero of the book, I suppose, with that broader picture of the war and Denmark trying to win back its freedom, I guess.
Yeah, it starts off with a scene that any cricket lover would recognise straight away, that the climax of a game and the sort of return to the clubhouse and the shutting down of the closing of the scoring book and everyone disappearing off. Even though it's in wartime Denmark, it could be anywhere in this country at a club sort of late in the season. It's very, very typical of how cricket is fairly uniform wherever it's being played.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to sort of take the reader on that journey from kind of universal themes that they would recognise into a very particular, specific context in Denmark, and take the reader also on a journey of understanding what Danish cricket was like at that stage. Partly because you have to know that in order to kind of make sense of this slightly mad, very brave journey that this individual goes on in the book.
Yeah, and to me, the cricket club is kind of like a microcosm for what's happening in Denmark in terms of trying to preserve or trying to survive against the threat of oblivion under Nazi Germany, and that the sort of the pretext of it, and really, I suppose where the journey that our hero is on is to, well, that's why he's called the Batmaker. He wants to find willow and materials to make cricket bats, which takes him on quite a risky expedition. I won't give away the ending of the book, but it's interesting that in doing so, he falls under the suspicion of the Gestapo for maybe being up to something that's a lot more sinister when maybe it isn't.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted an element of the book to be a duel between two individuals, and you get that with the Batmaker and the Gestapo chief. So the Gestapo chief is almost looking for a worthy adversary,
Yeah.
and he kind of almost mistakenly finds one in the Batmaker, and to some extent that becomes his kind of Achilles heel, and that's kind of the second half of the book. It kind of explains why. Whereas actually the Batmaker himself is on quite a personal quest to protect the game that he loves, and he's the sort of person that would not get involved in the war and would try and kind of get through the war unscathed. But yeah, he's the kind of individual that would probably try and lay low, but because of his passion for cricket, it kind of draws him out into hero status. He's almost an unlikely hero.
Yeah, yeah. And the pace picks up quite quickly. What starts off as a gentle portrait of a cricket club at the on the last game at the end of a season, um, you turn the pace quite nicely into becoming this sort of cat and mouse thriller, um, where Frederick's being chased through Copenhagen, through Denmark, and beyond. Um, I really like the way that you managed to write it so that it happened that way, and the pictures you paint of I mean, to me it's very, very evocative because the writing is good. That you know, you can. I've never been to. Actually, no, I have been to Copenhagen, but not wartime Copenhagen. But your writing paints a really good picture of how it might have looked at the time, and certainly how it felt under the shadow of the Nazis. How did you? I know you said you studied history, but there were any other sort of things that you drew on to sort of paint this picture of jazz clubs and you know, sort of dark, dimly lit streets, etc., etc.
Well, I have been like an avid reader of spy thrillers, I guess. So maybe I thought through osmosis, I kind of picked up some of that. But what I was sort of trying to get across was, which is not necessarily easy for an English reader in particular, because we obviously weren't in that situation, um, about having your kind of freedom curtailed and how much anxiety that would cause on a kind of day-to-day basis. You know, not knowing whether you were going to be kind of searched at a roadblock, not knowing if you were going to be kind of picked up in the middle of the night under suspicion of being a resistance fighter, and that kind of sense of anxiety, but also the sense of belief in something, almost the equivalent of the Blitz spirit, I suppose.
Yeah,
So I wanted to try and kind of get that across as well. And there are some scenes in the book where you do see the brutality of the Nazi regime, being enacted, but also um, some quite audacious fight back from the resistance, who went from, in the earlier part of the war, being quite tentative, to actually really putting their lives on the line to hit the Nazis where it hurt by the time that the book was set. So yeah, hopefully, that kind of context, comes across, and you can kind of, feel that kind of claustrophobic atmosphere that was, in Copenhagen at the time.
yeah, definitely. And yeah, I like that's kind of like it's almost like you pull back a cover on the city with the resistance and how it's working underground and in the shadow, and the amount of risk taking that goes on where people are trying to all achieve the same ends in slightly parallel ways, but they're all aiming in the same direction. And yeah, it's amazing. And my particular favourite passage of the book is at the woodcutter's hut, where he meets what he thinks is a surly character, and they end up forming quite a close bond.
Yeah, one element of it which I was trying to get across, and this was quite challenging, was almost the spiritual, almost spiritual process for him of making the bat itself, um, and how he kind of sort of translated his kind of passion into this kind of craft. And when he meets, that other character in the hut, he was someone who kind of shared that kind of love of wood and love of craft. And then he almost found a bit of a kind of soulmate there that could go along that part of the journey with him. Because he is worried about whether he can actually achieve this thing he's set out to do, whether it's going to work or not. He's definitely not assured from the beginning, and he has a few kind of wrong turns along the way, but he has some kind of allies, if you like, that help him get there.
That's right. And without giving it away, it's all got a very uplifting ending. And I quite like the fact that you've sort of a historical notes bit at the end, just to give a bit of backdrop and context to the subject matter, which really is a nice sort of bit to read. Because sometimes you read a book and you're a bit deflated afterwards, but that is something that's quite nice to just sort of, after you've turned the last page, is just have a look through a few pages of that, just to give you just a little bit more background color to what you've just read.
Yeah, I was trying to get across that, you know, although cricket is not, the number one sport in Denmark, it does have a long history and it does have a long culture, and it does matter to a lot of people. I think this is one of the points that people maybe don't quite get. Quite often in cricket writing, you see references to cricket being played in odd places across the world, in almost, and people almost kind of laughing at the strangeness of it. And that's fair enough. But I think when you actually meet cricket communities in countries where cricket is more of a minority sport, you cannot question the kind of passion and commitment, because these people are protecting a game which is always under threat. And I think we probably take it for granted in England, although we've got our own existential crisis around Test cricket and county cricket. Nevertheless, it is a well-established game, and there are cricket grounds everywhere you go. That is not the case in a lot of these other countries. And the zeal and the passion of cricket communities in these other countries is really inspiring, actually.
Well, it's a brilliant book. I really thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I would suggest everyone that is a follower of this program gets out there, and you can pre-order it now on all of your wherever you go, Amazon, etc., or even just get down to a proper bookshop and tell the man behind the counter you want a copy of The Batmaker of Copenhagen by Tim Brooks. It's published by Fish Publishing, I believe, and is available to pre-order now and out on the shelves on the 1st of April. Tim, I'm off to go and make myself some nettle tea. I don't know what you're doing now.
Some dinner, I think, after a long train journey.
Been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and really enjoyed the book. Congratulations. It was something completely different, wartime thriller mixed in with a bit of cricket. What's not to love? Absolutely fantastic. Tim, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Darren. Really great to talk to you.